Merci beaucoup, commandant Saïd Kenissa, pour nous avoir fait découvrir les subtilités autour de la détention des navires. En parlant de la détention des navires, il a parlé de 3 parties prenantes. Il a parlé des propriétaires, il a parlé des pays et ensuite il a parlé des sociétés de classification. Nous avons l'honneur d'avoir parmi nous le représentant d'une association de 12 sociétés de classification, l'IACS. Nous avons le représentant de l'IACS au niveau de l'Organisation Maritime Internationale parmi nous et c'est lui qui va venir tout de suite faire sa présentation. Mr. Konstantin PETROV, please.
Hello. Yes, it's me again, and thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you about the IACS, what we do, who we are. So I will give you a short introduction to the world of classification. I'll talk about a little bit about the history, what it is. Also mentioned IACS, who are the members, what our objectives are, and I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do, especially in light of what I mentioned at the beginning about the decarbonization and digitalization agenda. So, why classification? For that, we need to go back a couple of centuries. So, around the middle of the 18th century, the marine insurers decided that they need to understand the condition of the ships that they are insuring. And they were insuring the cargo on that ship, and it would be useful for them to understand on which basis the premiums should be assigned. So they decided to call for the experienced people, and those people will go around the ports, look at the ships and determine the condition of the ships and advise the insurer of that condition. So around that time, 1760, the system of classification was born, and the first classification society, Lloyd's Register, was established. The reason why it's called classification is because this was the means to show to the insurer quickly what was the condition of the ship. So the ship was classified. So the hull of the ship will be classified using the vowels A, I, O, U, depicting the best to the worst. So A will be the best condition of the hull, and then the rigging of the ship will be classified by using the words letters G, M, and B: good, middling, and bad. Later, when the ships have dropped the sails and started to deploy mechanical systems on board the ships, those were changed into 1, 2, and 3, the numbering system. So when the insurer was looking to understand the condition of the ship, it was very easy for the insurer to see the numbering or the classification against that ship. So a classification of A1 will be the best ship there is in the eyes of the expertise. Now, you can open the Oxford Dictionary and you can always find letters A1 as the explanation of the best. So this is where A1 comes from. It comes from the Lloyd's Register system of classification of the condition of the ship, the rigging, or the machinery on board. But basically, once you have the system in place, the question is, what does the classification society do? And really, it starts with looking at the plans. So when the shipbuilder wants to build a ship, the shipbuilder produces design and produces the plans, and then the plans are submitted for the verification. So it's the job of the classification society, plan approval surveyors, to look at those plans and compare them or assess them against the rules of that classification society. This is something very different from, for example, other organizations which can also set standards. For example, ISO, the standard organization, the IEC. For example. The difference is that whilst they set the standards, they do not oversee the implementation or adherence to those standards. On the other hand, classification societies do exactly that. They set the standard, they develop the rules, and then they oversee the compliance. So they get the assessment of the society, of the compliance of the ship with the rules. Now, once that is done, then the ship is surveyed. Over the period, as you know, of the life of the ship, the classification society surveyor will go on board the ship once a year of a certain degree of survey. Then at the intermediate survey, between 2 and 3 years, 2.5 years, we'll do the intermediate survey. And then lastly, the surveyor will do a 5-year, once in a 5-year survey, which is in classification world is called a special survey. In the statutory world, in IMO world, it's called a renewal survey. As the ship gets older, the rigor of the surveys increase. So for a younger ship, you may have the scope of the survey lesser than if you have a 20 or 25-year-old ship. So the more time will be spent on an older vessel. What also is an important part of that environment is what is known as the classification cycle. So this works as an iterative process where the rules are continuously improved. So if you can imagine the first set of rules being published around the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, those rules have evolved through the knowledge obtained through this classification cycle. So when we first understand, for example, from the research and development, what the performance is of the structure of the mechanical systems, that gets fed into the rules. So the rules are created on the basis of the input from research and development. And then the rules are applied through the plan approval in the shipbuilding process, then the overseeing of the construction of the ship, so there is an understanding of how the rules behave in that point of time. When the ship is delivered in operation, surveyors come along and they check the compliance of the ship against the same rules, and then we learn to recycle and improve the rules, and eventually we get to where we are today with the level of safety. This is also very clearly seen in the role of IACS and the role of class societies in IMO. So the same rule cycle is also very relevant to the IMO process in the way that we contribute to the IMO. And this has been established and recognized in the connection between the class society's work, the class society rules, and the IMO conventions, and this is where the synergies between the links between the class societies and the governments have started to establish. I mean, if we go back to the middle of the 19th century, this was the very first time when the classification society surveyors were used by one particular government, one particular country, to survey, for example, load line. And that was how the relationship started to emerge. In 1998, the SOLAS Convention was amended to introduce this regulation of the Chapter 2.1, Regulation 3.1, which has solidified that link. And the SOLAS Convention is now explicit that for the ship to be able to carry statutory certificates, the ship needs also to be classed by a recognized organization or classification society recognized by the flag state. So this is a very critical piece of legislation which establishes that link and really makes it very clear that both go hand in hand. But it's the cycle again which plays into this whole development process, because by that and performing the role of the recognized organization, we are able to understand how the IMO rules are developing and how IMO rules are able to be improved and how they mature. So as I mentioned, in the middle of the 19th century, the first time for the load line convention, the classification societies were used to go and survey the ship, because they are already there. Their stations, their surveyors were already scattered around the world, and it was not difficult for them to also take on the job of something that the government needed to do, and therefore supervise the location of the load line marks. But nowadays we have a lot of governments who turn to classification societies to act on their behalf. So class societies have authorizations from more than 130 governments around the world. And they delegate their functions to a limited degree to the class societies, which they call recognized organizations. And you can be a class society, you can be a recognized organization, but there's a few who are both recognized organizations and a class society. There's a difference, obviously, between the class society role and the recognized organization role. So a class society literally will look after the compliance with its own rules. So the structure, mechanical, engineering systems. But when they act at the same time as the recognized organization, they will also look at the instruments which IMO developed and which the flag state decided to authorize to that class society. So SOLAS, various chapters of SOLAS, MARPOL, load line, those basic conventions. And as we go forward, as the IMO expands its instruments, ballast water treatment conventions, anti-fouling convention, and so forth. But in that role, whilst classification societies are reliant on themselves, make decisions for themselves because it's their rules which they apply, when they're acting as recognized organizations, they're very much within the orbit of the government. In order to make decisions, they need to turn to the government. It works seamlessly because the relationships have been established for a long time, but nevertheless, the responsibility still rests with the government. Because at the end of the day, what the recognized organizations do, at the end of the survey, they issue a certificate, a statutory certificate, on behalf of the government. So the government delegates the authority, but it keeps the responsibility. And all this is captured in the agreements between those class societies, recognized organizations, with the governments. So the statutory services agreement is a legal instrument which describes that relationship, liability, responsibility, communication, which rules to use, which national legislation to apply, the limitation of that, and this is how the class societies and recognized organizations act when they come and survey ships on board the ships. Today in IACS we have 12 members. Actually not showing, I think it's probably the software, it's not showing all the logos. But we have the American Bureau of Shipping, Bureau Veritas, the Chinese Classification Society, Detnorsky Veritas, RINA Italian Class Society, Korean Register. We have recently welcomed Turkey Lloyd a year ago into our fold. And we have Croatian Register, we have the Polish Register. The sizes vary from the very big of nearly 300 million gross tonnage of DNV class ships to smaller class societies. All are welcomed as long as you can demonstrate the adherence to the quality standards over the period of more than 12-15 years, new constructions in service, and if once that is done, you have your own rules and regulations, then those are welcomed to undergo the assessment. But once they're in association, they really come together to try to develop common or unified standards or requirements. They work together to help the industry, to help the regulators, the IMO and the governments, to give the feedback on the compliance of the ships and the rules and how those perform. So it's a partnership to a degree which has been helping both IMO and the industry for now more than 50 years. So the association was established in 1968. It became the non-governmental organization with the consultative status at IMO in 1969. So we've been cooperating with the governments, with industry as association for those many years. So what do we produce? You may ask yourself, well, fine, you exist, but what's the point? Well, the point is we are, like I said, a standard setting organization. We define the requirements, and the products of those processes is really, it's a unified requirement It's called the unified requirements. It's the requirements in the scope of the classification. So covering the hull, mechanical, machinery, and mechanical engineering systems. That's classification. Then we also do what's called a procedural requirement. Those are internal IACS requirements for membership on how to go about in their processes. For example, transfer of class, which is very familiar to the ship owners. How does one go about transferring class from one class society to another? What are the limitations? What are the conditions? What to look for? How to exchange plans? What to do in the absence of plans? How to go and whether there should be a particular scope of survey and for which age of the ship. So all that is prescribed. We also have a category of the output which is called unified interpretations. Those are distinct from the unified requirements because unified interpretations are on the matter of the statutory instruments, the conventions of IMO, that is from the governments. Here we are also governed by the agreements between the recognized organizations and the governments, because only the governments can interpret their own instruments. Class societies cannot, recognized organizations cannot. But in order to assist IMO and to assist the governments, out of that regulatory cycle that I mentioned earlier, we have the experience and we develop the interpretation which we bring to IMO for IMO to debate together with all the governments and to say, are we correct, are we not correct, shall we apply them or shall we not apply them? So that's another output. Recently, for about 20 years now, another very clearly important output is the common structural rules. So this is the first time, 15 or 20 years ago, the classification societies came together and said that really competition on standards from the shipyards is not good for safety. We need to have a common standard which is really, really common amongst all classification societies or within IACS. Because we don't want to see shipyards playing one class society against the other in pursuance of lower steel, lower weight, and therefore lower costs for the ship. So we decided at that time in 2005, 2006, to create a complete body of rules, not unified simply, but common. And from then on, we have the common structure rules, and those are being applied by the membership. Since then, we have the goal-based standards regulations, and the IMO now reviews the common structure rules. Every time they're amended, we submit those changes. So we have a significant oversight program from the IMO, from the governments, how to do the work. So that's really the bulk of our work as we develop the unified requirements and interpretations, common structure rules. This is, in a sense, the bottom part of the iceberg. This is a lot of work going on, a massive amount of work. But, as I mentioned in my address, there are trends which we just simply cannot ignore, and it influences everybody, and so it does us. So we have developed a few years ago, 2 years ago, the three directions. This is on digitalization, decarbonization, and we started to look again at human element as a vital, critical component of that change. So I'll spend a few moments to update you where we are on those. So, on safe decarbonization, we realized 2 or 3 years ago that the approaches by the different parties in the world, be it those shipbuilders, ship owners, equipment makers, governments, and class societies are different. And it doesn't help in us moving in one direction if we maintain that dispersed approach. So we thought that we need to bring that effort together. And we worked very hard with a number of governments, and we put together a proposal to the Maritime Safety Committee, 108th session, where we asked for the IMO to have a program of looking at the safe decarbonization. So as now there's a particular piece of work happening at IMO on looking at safe decarbonization. They've been obviously working on the fuels of ammonia and others, but this sets a completely straightforward course on considering all safety aspects related to decarbonization. And that also set ourselves up for a very nice way of feeding the information into what's going on and doing our own work in connection with that. So we have a dedicated panel to that, and it's starting to look at various aspects of decarbonization, from ammonia, as I mentioned, you can see on the screen, hydrogen. We're looking at batteries, we're looking at wind-assisted vessels from the point of view of stability and so forth. And also we've started to look at nuclear. But nuclear is not a new subject. It's been around for a while, but it's something which definitely is worth considering. It's costly. There's a very strong, very critical upfront cost to build a nuclear-powered ship. Obviously, in operation, it offsets if you have a ship operating for 25 years. But the world has moved on since 1980s, when the IMO nuclear ship code was developed. And there are reactors, small modular reactors, which are out there, and you can power them up to last for 5 years with a low enrichment, and therefore you can use those reactors and you can play it around like they're plug and play, and also you can adjust them, their performance on the basis of your own schedules, renewal service schedules. So it's a flexible way of approaching it. This particular solution. Also, you don't need to own actually the reactor. It can be leased on a power by hour basis. There are all sorts of commercial arrangements around that. But really, the critical point for us is not that. The critical point for us is the safety. So the other points that we have is looking at the digital transformation, where we have the work on what we need to do on the cybersecurity. Cyber resilience. We have a number of requirements which we've developed, and we're making those applicable for your benefit and for the benefit of ship owners. We're looking also at the ship data quality. As the saying goes, rubbish in, rubbish out. So you can't have data going onto unmanned or highly automated ship where that data is not quality checked and verified. So we're looking at that. And all sorts of other things in the guise of developing the mass requirements of marine autonomous ships at IMO. And obviously the last point that I wanted to make is on the human element. Sometimes in all this technical work, a person on board the ship gets overlooked, and we should never overlook the people or seafarers who are doing this job. And though there are elements that we're looking at for people impacting on equipment, and those elements which are impact on the human being. So human-centered design is something which we will be looking very closely in when we're developing our own requirements. So we created the guideline for our people, our surveyors and our people developing requirements to look at those. So I guess that means I'm done. And I am. Thank you very much.